Good afternoon, or should I say good evening, everybody. And thank you very much for taking the time to attend this session organised by the British Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore. My name is Samuel Sharp, and I'm the Managing Director of the law firm Sharp & Jagger. I'm also a committee member of the Finance and FinTech Business Committee at the British Chamber of Commerce. Today, the presentation and discussion is entitled Next Level Fraud, Dealing with the Theft of Crypto Assets. And I'm also delighted to introduce our guest speakers. We have Benjamin E., who's Managing Director in the Risk Advisory and Investigations Practice of FTI Consulting here in Singapore. And his colleague, Mason Drew, who's also a Managing Director in the Cybersecurity Practice, also from FTI Consulting here in Singapore. Ben and Mason have a wealth of experience in fraud prevention, investigation, and asset tracing. And I'm very much looking forward to their insights and war stories on this very hot topic at the moment. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. So this is an interactive webinar, and for those of you who are joining live, if you want to ask any of the speakers, including me, a question today, please post in the dedicated Q&A box, which is just at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom toolbar. And we will try to address as many questions as we can throughout the session. There'll also be some time for Q&A at the end. So if you don't have a question during the course of the presentation, we can deal with anything that comes to mind in the time we have at the end. This session will also be available on the Chamber's on-demand section of the website and also on their social media channels as well. So you can always come back and look at it again, and it will be available after the session has finished. If I could trouble Catherine just to move a couple of slides forward, and I'll introduce just one more slide. Excellent. Okay, so a quick introduction as to what we're going to cover. Mason is going to be covering an introduction to cryptocurrency, cyber and electronic fraud. Recent strategies of criminals targeting businesses, including breaking into networks to send phishing emails, the use of bots, as well as audio and visual fraud techniques. He'll look at some cautionary tales of organizations who've suffered such attacks, and also what internal procedures organizations should have to deal with cyber or electronic fraud. Ben's going to be looking at conducting an independent investigation and fraud detection techniques, and going over a summary of conducting an independent investigation, fraud detection techniques for employees and managers, what technical options an organization has to both discover potential fraudulent activity, as well as recover money or data obtained by fraud. And if you're still with us at the end of that, the third part of this presentation will be conducted by me, which is essentially looking at what legal tools are available to assist individuals and organizations which have been the victims of fraud, both here in Singapore, but also applicable to other countries as well. Looking at some of the tools that both the criminal justice system and the civil justice system can give you to both assist your investigation and get a remedy. I'll also be very briefly covering a major new development in the law here in Singapore, picking up from developments in the law in England on special types of injunctions which have been usefully deployed in fraud cases involving cryptocurrencies. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mason, who will take us through the first part of this session.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. So hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Mason Drew. As Sam said, I am a managing director with FTI based here in Singapore. I've been with FTI for about a year now, leading our cybersecurity practice in the region and helping clients deal with their cybersecurity challenges. Before joining FTI, I spent about 13 years with the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation. At the beginning of that career, I spent about 7 years conducting field investigations into network intrusions, primarily at large clients such as Fortune 500 companies. Following that, I spent about 3 years with the United States as a secondee to the United States National Security Agency, where I represented the Bureau's interests there internally in the organization, and then dealing with stakeholders in the Asia Pacific region. And most recently, prior to my transition to the private sector, I was in Beijing, where I represented the FBI's interest to the Chinese government. So with that, I'll kick it off here. If we could, next slide, please. This slide is basically just a way to help quantify sort of the cost of cyber risk and cyber fraud. There's all kinds of stats, and of course you could find as many stats as you would like for most anything. The one that I've seen bandied about that I sort of like the methodology on was by a firm called Cybersecurity Venture, and they basically estimated that in 2021 there was 20 billion in cyber fraud, and that's a year-on-year growth rate. That was from ransomware alone, and that's a year-on-year growth rate of 30%. Next slide, please. So before we talk much about cryptocurrency fraud, it probably would make sense to discuss what cryptocurrency is briefly, and I assume many folks in the audience have exposure to or maybe perhaps intimate knowledge of cryptocurrency, so I won't spend too much time on it. But I will say that cryptocurrency is effectively it's a means of conducting a transaction with a party that you don't necessarily trust on a network that you don't trust. So really, when we talk about a coin, a crypto coin, we're talking about a shared ledger, aka a blockchain, right? So it's basically a public ledger. There are many different versions of cryptocurrency. This is sort of roughly speaking. There's a shared ledger whereby I can say, or Alice pays Bob $5, or 5 coins, or whatever the unit of measure is. It goes out of his or her account and goes into the other party's account, and everyone agrees on it. So, when it comes to cryptocurrency, why has there been this major explosion basically in digital extortion? We should step back just a couple steps and say, the fundamental underpinnings of cryptocurrencies, one, the internet, right? So now we basically have a way to have real world impacts on people and organizations in regions with different sovereignty on the other side of the world very easily. And two, strong encryption, right? But by that I mean public, asymmetric or public key cryptography. So these two things basically fundamentally underpin crypto. Cryptocurrency couldn't work without them, right? And so now we have the rise of cryptocurrency, which unsurprisingly is perfectly coincides with this dramatic rise in cyber fraud and ransomware for a couple of reasons. One of the characteristics of cryptocurrency is that it's immutable. So changes to the blockchain are effectively instantaneous and irreversible. So this is in contrast to the way the international banking system works, right? So in my previous life, I spent a lot of time dealing with fraud in the international banking system, and if you have as well, you probably are a lot of people who deal with the international banking system are understandably frustrated with the ability to recover assets, but at least a mechanism does exist, right? There is a capability there in a way that with cryptocurrency that doesn't really exist at all. Prior to cryptocurrency, if you wanted anonymity in a financial transaction, there's basically not by design, but a unique property of, you basically had to use cash. And one of the unique properties of cash, of course, is that the difficulty of conducting an anonymous transaction scales with size, right? Basically, certainly speaking of US dollars, right? It's impractical to make large transactions in cash just because of the physical volume and weight of a transaction involving several millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars. But cryptocurrency, of course, completely eliminates that. It eliminates a lot of frictions, both good and bad. And then it's sort of another characteristic of cryptocurrency is that it's pseudonymous, right? So most cryptocurrencies are actually not anonymous. They do, what you can see on the blockchain is a wallet address. So you may not, depending on your viewpoint or capabilities, you may not be able to associate that address or unique identity with a particular individual, but you oftentimes can trace transactions through the blockchain. And so, so we have this new technology that is blockchain itself probably will fundamentally alter the way a lot of things work in the world over the next 20 years. I probably shouldn't talk about my personal views on cryptocurrency because I'm not a huge fan, but the underlying technology is transformative, and so when we talk about cryptocurrency fraud, as it shows on the slide here, I mean, theft is basically you in order to protect a wallet or to make a transaction from one wallet to another, you have a private key. It's a password. If someone else gets that password, they can conduct a transaction. If you lose your password, you lose access to that wallet, which is why there's estimates in terms of how much Bitcoin is basically lost forever. It's likely a significant percentage of all the Bitcoin that is not in circulation, but that has been mined or produced is completely inaccessible and forever will be, because wallets were lost, right? And that means private keys to those wallets were lost. So I'll talk about so basically what the reason I say that is because if you lose your private key or it's stolen, you effectively can and usually do lose your cryptocurrency. So this is what I would put in the category of cryptocurrency theft. So anything you do that can cause that loss makes you vulnerable. So any kind of compromise to your computer, whether it be something very simple or something very complex like ransomware or targeted attack. I mean, if your computer is compromised, and there are bots that specifically do this, they compromise computers and sort of query them for private keys. You can lose your crypto. A lot of people, of course, I would say at this point in time, the great majority of people that own, so to speak, a cryptocurrency don't actually have a wallet on their personal computer, right? What they do is they've gone to a cryptocurrency exchange, and they have a third party, the exchange, who buys and transacts and stores their cryptocurrency for them. So interestingly, this creates a lot of other issues because there's almost no regulation at this point with these exchanges. And I think a good example of this is Coinbase is one of the largest exchanges in the world. And recently, I think in the last couple of weeks, they were required in a disclosure to talk about some of the risks for their customers. And apparently, customers of Coinbase are considered unsecured creditors in a bankruptcy proceeding. So which means basically if Coinbase goes bankrupt, they possibly could not get their funds back until more senior creditors were paid. So this is not like a bank at all, right? All these funds are commingled, and the large question in general with cryptocurrency is what is it that you actually own? So another interesting thing is that Bitcoin, specifically speaking, there's many different cryptocurrencies, and one of the challenges a lot of the newer cryptocurrencies are trying to overcome is the rate at which transactions can be conducted on the blockchain. Bitcoin is the first cryptocurrency, and it is notoriously slow, only able to conduct several thousand transactions per. I think I actually don't recall off the top of my head. I think it's per minute. But regardless, that's not nearly enough for the amount of transactions that are happening. And so what is going on in a lot of these crypto exchanges is that many of these transactions that, say, for example, I'm transferring money to my sister or someone I bought something from, a lot of these transactions are actually not happening on the ledger. They're not happening on this publicly shared blockchain. They're happening in-house. And so, and maybe being recorded on the chain later, if at all. And so, there's all of these risks associated with cryptocurrency. And many of them are cyber risks, right? So, another, I can talk briefly about NFTs. NFTs are basically, it's another blockchain. It's a ledger, but on the ledger, what we've got is we've got, other things in your wallet than coins, right? So, for example, you can own, what you typically own with most NFT chains is a URL, right? Which is basically a link to a website. And so again, going back to the question of what is it that you actually own, the creator of the encrypted messaging app Signal is a gentleman named Moxie Marlinspike, and he did an interesting proof of concept where he basically created an NFT where the image, right? Most not all, but most NFTs at this point are basically images. The image that is displayed is dependent upon where you access the image from. Basically, So if you're buying an NFT and what it's showing you is a URL, there's a server somewhere that is serving you this image when you try to access it, and it can tell based on an IP address or a user agent where the requester is coming from. So again, if you're probably aware, but there is a large platform for exchanging NFTs called OpenSea. Basically, if you access your NFT from OpenSea, the one that he created, it looks like a fractal image. If you buy it and then view it from a personal computer and access your wallet, it looks like a poop emoji, right? And this is a proof of, he's sort of making a point here is that, what do you actually own? So fundamentally, I would say that is one of these large risks with crypto. I mean, and so in terms of scams, I'll get into some of the scams and the techniques that we're talking about, but basically they're all the same. I mean, none of the stuff is really particularly unique to crypto. You could do it sort of with banking, you could do it with computer compromises, but because crypto is so new and so unregulated and largely misunderstood, it makes it much easier. Next slide, please. I think I may have bored Catherine to death. Okay, great, she's back. So this is a typical business email compromise. Before I get into that, I want to say one other thing about crypto. There's a couple of other frauds. Again, this fraud isn't necessarily technical. When cryptocurrency is created, there's a lot of ways to do it. Typically, it's called an ICO. It's an initial coin offering. So basically, someone creates or invents a cryptocurrency out of thin air, and then they offer you, in effect, some bits and bytes, right, which represents your ownership of the cryptocurrency. In order for them to give it to you, they get fiat currency. They get sort of quote unquote real money. And so this is something that happens commonly when groups will create new coins, sell it all, and then disappear. So this is what's called a rug pull in the crypto space. And again, I just sort of return to this aspect of total, again, sort of no regulation here. So be careful what you're getting into in general. One common way that people are defrauded, super common, we see it a lot in the mortgage lending space, is a business email compromise. We see it a lot in the corporate space. I dealt with many of these over the years. It's still super amazingly common. And basically what you have is you have two people conducting a transaction, communicating over email. In this particular fraud, one of a few things can happen. The email of one of the two people communicating is compromised, or the channel itself that they're using to communicate is compromised. But either way, the end result is the same, and that is that an outsider has some insight into the communications that are taking place. So as an outsider, if you have knowledge that one of the things that we commonly see is large organizations that do regular billing, and so you'll have someone that regularly gets an invoice and sends out large sums of money, $200,000 a month. This is a regular pattern. They have a long-standing relationship with the person in the organization sending the invoice. Then one day they get an email basically saying, "Hey, we've changed our banking information. Please send it to this account instead." Right, and of course it's not particularly alerting or alarming because it's coming from a familiar email account, and it's a transaction that's an ongoing regular transaction. And so basically someone inserted themselves into this communication chain and changed one thing. They basically changed the banking information, and lots of money has been lost this way. I have personally worked on business email compromise investigations for tens of millions of dollars. So it's amazing how fundamental email is to almost all of the fraud that still takes place. Email is sort of inherently insecure, and so that's a topic for another day. That's the basic idea behind business email compromise. Next slide, please. Some other types. So another common type of fraud, which you're probably familiar with, is phishing, right? And of course, this is when the traditional form of phishing is when someone sends emails to, for example, the entire directory of a large corporation with some nonsense message to get or entice users to click on a link. Again, I'm returning to the inherently insecure nature of email. So the link typically goes to a website that is going to use some sort of exploit, whereby just by clicking on the link, the computer is compromised. Of course, depending on the sophistication of the attacker at that point, they would conduct recon, they might move laterally in the network, they would try and escalate privileges to sort of quote unquote own the network. And then they could do lots of things. Most common is ransomware, but there's a lot of things they could do with that access. They could sell it, right? So spear phishing is the same concept, except that it's much more targeted. So for example, you might have a high value target like the CEO or C-suite level executive that has either sensitive information or potentially certain financial accesses for the organization. So you want to target them specifically. And in a classic spear phishing, you would collect information from any source you could gather, whether it be the internet or potentially real world context, to craft an email that is not alerting at all in order to get someone to basically click on a link. And I can give you an example. I saw this in my previous life. We had a very high ranking organization in a large corporation who received a spear phishing email that was appeared to be from the coach of his son's soccer team, right? With a PDF attached to it that was like the soccer schedule. This is completely unalerting because it's all accurate information. He had a son, his son was on a soccer team, it came from the right place. So which is kind of scary in a sense, because someone's done a fair amount of work to look into your life to get you to click on a link. So there are a lot of good commercial solutions at this point to protect organizations, basically to protect you from yourself in terms of clicking on malicious links. This mobile phishing it's the same concept. It's just a different medium. So that of course would be the same thing, but be an SMS, right? So this, I think the best example of this, certainly here in Singapore, would be the Ocbc scam that happened fairly recently. And users got an SMS from the bank saying, hey, we've seen some fraud. Click on this link and log in and make sure your account's okay. Of course, the link itself was not OCBC. And so actually there was no failure in OCBC's controls. Again, this is based on public information I have read on the internet. I don't know how much they've disclosed. This is based on my reading of it, but there was no failure in the controls that OCBC had in place. This was basically what you call a man-in-the-middle scam, right? So you go to a website that appears to be OCBC. It's actually being run by fraudsters. Then you log into your account. They take your credentials and pass them to OCBC, who then of course says, hey, you need to do two-factor authentication and contacts you. But since you are assuming you're trying to log into your account, you pass the two-factor information. So you do effectively log into your account. There's just fraudsters in the middle who are doing all of this and seeing everything that's going on in between and capturing your credentials. And at that point, of course, they can transfer money out of your account. So this is called a man-in-the-middle attack. It's, again, very common. It doesn't just have to happen in the banking space. Next slide, please. So I can talk. I'm looking at my clock here. I'm gonna run over on time. So a lot of fraud that happens, certainly that can impact crypto, but that can just impact you generally in the cyberspace is perpetrated by botnets. And so a botnet is basically a large pool of computers that a criminal or a bad guy can control. The way this typically works is that you're looking for unsecured. If you were to create a botnet, you basically build a self-perpetuating virus, or you use a pre-existing botnet to scan and try to infect many computers. Oftentimes they're computers that are old, they're unpatched, they're easily compromised. So we're talking like it can be a point of sale systems at an old store, or the Windows 98 machine in the back room of a gas station. There's millions of these machines on the internet. And so, the larger they are, the more useful they are. So you get this massive pool of computers that you have now installed basically remote command and control software on. And oftentimes you accompany this with a command and control architecture that's a bunch of computers on the internet, whereby you can sort of task this large pool of computers, this botnet, to do things for you. So these are some of the things that botnets are used for, right? Credential stuffing is a scam where if you've compromised, for example, a large vendor and you've got the usernames and passwords of millions of users, you then use a botnet to try these same credentials on many, many other sites, because oftentimes people don't change their passwords. Another technique is the denial of service. So if you want to basically commit some sort of digital extortion, you can go to an entity and say, hey, we're going to shut down your public-facing website because I have 1 million computers I can use to basically conduct a denial of service attack on your website. So botnets are used for this. We've seen this with account fraud. You can use botnets to circumvent. So a lot of websites have controls in place to identify bots, right? This is the idea behind a CAPTCHA. but they can be circumvented, and you can use bots to create hundreds of thousands of accounts, on various entities to do whatever nefarious thing you might want to be doing. So that's the basic idea behind a botnet, and they're used for a lot of stuff like this. The bots are typically botnets, as well as credentials, as well as a lot of stolen wallets. All of this stuff is typically negotiated for, sold on the dark web. The dark web is simply, in its most simple form, the dark web is a resource on the internet that has no publicly knowable way or means of accessing it. So it'd be like if I created a server on the internet with a URL, but I never published it. It's effectively dark because you cannot find it. So if I through some sort of out of band communication channel pass this URL to a conspirator or co-conspirator, we could effectively communicate in the dark. That's like a really classic definition. Nowadays, it would probably be something more like what's called an overlay network. So the most common one is Tor, which stands for the onion router. And I'm happy to talk about Tor, but I don't know that I have time. But Tor basically is a way to you have a bunch of computers on the internet or owners of computers that run servers. They basically volunteered. They say, hey, we believe in anonymity, we believe in privacy, and so those two things are noble to some extent. But of course, oftentimes you have a lot of bad actors that use them, and so you basically have a way to encrypt and transfer messages around the internet where it is impossible for a third party, typically even a very well-funded large third party, to track the path of those messages through the network. So they cannot identify, if they catch bad traffic, they cannot identify the origin of traffic. Or if you're sending it out and you're under scrutiny or you're being monitored, they cannot identify the endpoint of the traffic that you're sending out. So when people talk about the dark web, they're typically talking about the Tor network at this point. Next slide, please. Great. So here we've got the bot ecosystem, right? So this I can talk. This is going back into botnets here a little bit. A lot of so bots. So of course, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency comes into play here because you have a way for criminals to conduct transactions completely outside the international banking system, which is awesome for doing nefarious stuff. And so you have a whole ecosystem where you now have bots as a service, right? Where you basically you can create a large botnet, you can rent it out, on a time basis. You could think of it something like Amazon Web Services or a cloud service provider. How many bots do you need? How long do you need them for? What level of resources in terms of storage or CPU are we talking about? And all of this is sort of effectively facilitated with cryptocurrency. It would be very difficult to do any of this without cryptocurrency. Next slide, please. So these are some really basic things that I think, again, everyone is probably aware of, but they're worth reiterating just because they're, if you take a very sort of simple but thorough baseline of protection, you can avoid almost all of the fraud that I've discussed. So the one I'll touch on initially is the most important, and that's multi-factor authentication. So if you don't have multi-factor authentication on pretty much every device that you use, you should be there. I think major mail service providers are starting to require this. It's amazing. It's 2022, and I still don't think it's actually required, but it might be opt-out at this point. For example, I think Gmail, you may have to opt out at this point. But basically, multi-factor authentication is in addition to a password and a username, you need some other means of identifying yourself. So of course, when people talk about passwords or when people talk about security and identification, they talk oftentimes about three things. They talk about having something that you have, something that you know, and something that you are, right? So something that you have nowadays is basically a cell phone. So your cell phone already probably has biometric some sort of way to identify you biometrically, a fingerprint, or I guess Apple has the face scanning. So if you are in possession of your phone and the phone has verified that you are the user, in addition to a password, this is much stronger security than just having a password. If you lose your password or someone compromises your password, now they also have to have your phone and also have to be able to unlock it. In fact, it's so secure. There's been a lot of studies that showed us dramatically just using something that you have, even without a password, is significantly better security than a password. And so what you're seeing is that certain systems, I think Microsoft Office 365 might be making this available, where you don't even need a password. They're moving passwordless, because passwords basically have created so many problems for users that they're moving basically to something that you are and something that you have, as opposed to something that you know. So another thing is this is all common sense stuff. If something looks a little suspicious or looks a little funny, it probably is. So just sort of be aware of, again, email is just fundamentally flawed from a security standpoint. So be careful. And lastly, if you do encounter fraud, report it, because again, sort of speaking from previous experience, it doesn't seem like much, but most national law enforcement agencies have portals for receiving this information, and then they have full-time teams that will correlate it, right? So to sort of aggregate it and identify trends and sort of notify others, and sort of it's just an effective way of helping out other people and generally protecting society. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think this is my last slide, and I don't want to read this checklist to you, but you can take a look at it. These are, again, this is sort of a pretty basic list that you might want to consider as an organization of steps you could take, and you can just sort of look at it right now, and depending on where your role in the organization or what you do, you could kind of get an idea like, do we have gaps in our security posture? Do we have procedures or policies in place to kind of manage some of these things? Obviously, incident response plans. What are we going to do? It's inevitable that you will have some sort of issue, right? Whether it's ransomware or some sort of shutdown. So, basically, if you have thought about what you might do before it happens, your response is significantly more likely to be better, right? This is identifying sort of what data you have, the level of sensitivity, where it's stored, right? And again, sort of, and this is of course something that FTI does regularly with organizations, but conducting holistic cybersecurity risk assessments, probably you should be using an industry accepted best practice standard, right? To just go through and say, hey, what systems do we have in place? What procedures and policies do we have in place? And in terms of best practices, where are the gaps? And what else could we do to improve our posture? So that's all I've got. And I think once I'm going to kick it over to Benjamin E, who's my colleague here at FTI, to talk about conducting some of these investigations. But at the end, I think we'll have some time for Q&A if anyone's got questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mason. I think you've done quite a good job in just covering that whole spectrum of cybersecurity fraud and how to go about preventing the fraud. Hi everyone, my name is Ben. I'm managing director with the investigation practice here in FTI Consulting. I've been with FTI for about 3 years, covering corporate fraud and asset tracing in Southeast Asia. In my prior life, I was with a Big Four. I was leading the Big Four practice in Beijing. As you can imagine, in Beijing, China, that's quite a bit of fraud that's going on, and we receive a lot of requests from MNCs, especially because we through us, we are the lens for them as to what's happening to some of the subsidiaries, some of the vendors that might be involved in certain fraud allegations. And I think it's pretty timely that we channel into this particular topic right now, conducting an independent investigation. Catherine, can you move to the next slide, please? In the next slide. Because when something happens, when a fraud happens, most of the time companies will want to react to it. And fraud doesn't really happen a lot in particular company. And that's where we come in and we help clients to go through a decision-making process as to what is the best way to go about conducting investigation. Now, as I said, I'm a forensic accountant. I'm not a cybersecurity expert. But then again, in conducting an investigation, be it whether by traditional sense of traditional fraud investigations or any cybersecurity or any cyber type of fraud, it's going to be pretty similar. And I think the next few slides, when I talk through, I'll go back and forth between traditional fraud and also if you conduct a cyber fraud investigation, how do we go about doing that? Now, think of it as this way. The AC receive an allegation from the vendor where the vendor is complaining that they have not been receiving their payments for a number of months, right? And the company claimed that they have. So the AC goes back to the management and asks, well, what is happening and how can we go about leading this investigation? Because they need to get to the root of the issue. Imagine the payment that's being made is hundreds of thousands or even to the millions of dollars if it's going to be a manufacturing company. The AC would then have to make a decision whether they should lead the investigation or management to lead the investigation. Can we move on next? So if, let's say, management were to lead the investigations, what needs to be considered is the reaction of the stakeholders reacting to the findings of the investigation. Is that investigation robust enough? Is that investigation independent enough such that when it's being released to public, they would not affect the share price, or that shareholders will not call the investigation report into questioning? Or that if the regulators want to know about what's happening, would the regulators see it as independent enough, especially when management were to lead it? Now, it would be a different story if AC, the audit committee, were to lead these. And very often, they go through a process of, well, who should they engage? Should they get the internal auditors to do this? Or they should go out and engage third parties to do it? Again, if it's going to be internal auditors to conduct the investigation, a few questions will come to mind. Do they have the expertise? Are they, do they have the expertise? Are they well versed enough, or are they independent enough to make a call if this particular fraud involves senior management, right? And how the stakeholders will react to this investigation report. Of course, then if you move down the line and say, yes, they should engage third party to investigate, then there are a few vendors out there that the audit committee may want to think about. One will be public relations, because it really depends on the findings of the report. Do they need to make public disclosure? And if so, how should they go about making such public announcements? Then you have, next please, Catherine. You have the forensic investigators and the lawyers typically working hand in hand, because the forensic investigators, and I'm using forensic investigators in a very broad sense, and I'll explain in the next few slides why forensic investigators. I'm sorry, Catherine, can you move back, please? Thank you. No, the prior slide. So forensic investigators work pretty hand in hand with the lawyers because they are the fact finders. And when that comes up, some of these findings might lead to potential breaches of the law. And that's where the lawyers will come in and make that call or the observation for the clients, for the audit committee. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in any investigation, typically a few questions in mind come into play. One, have the allegations been validated? If you recall, the allegation over here is that the vendor claimed that they haven't been paid for a number of months, but management claim that they have been paying the vendors for a number of months. Then if so, what really happened? Where did the money go? Was that being diverted? Who knew of the misconduct? Was it management? Was it any employees? And what did they do about that? The magnitude of the misconduct, magnitude when you talk about here, the amount of losses, and were there any potential breaches of laws and regulations? Last but not least, who were responsible for this issue. So if you think in terms of a cyber breach, you think in terms of the business email that's being sent and being monitored by potentially a Trojan that is implanted into a company's email system. They're able to profile to see what happened, right? Who are the decision makers? Who are the approvers? And many of these questions ought to be answered during the investigation. Next slide, please. And so that's where, as I was mentioning, when we talk about forensic investigators, there are quite a number of specialists that might be required in the investigation. The forensic accountants ourselves, what we do is we look at transactions, we look at financial transactions, and I'll come to it how we select those financial transactions. But typically, after selecting these transactions, we go through the process of looking at the contracts, the invoices, the process, the procurement process, who approved them, the sales process again, what went on with the emails, did the client request for the information or request for the products, right up to the point of the products being shipped out. Then on the right side, you see appearing some business intelligence investigators. Now, they would come in when there are some questions with regards to the background of some of the subjects we want to know better. And there are two ways to go about doing this. One is to go through what we call publicly available information, right? That there are databases out there to do checks on subjects, individuals, or companies that we want to know about them, whether they're on a sanctions list, or whether they had been. Are there any negative reputation in the media? Or the second part to it, what we call level 2 review, is us going down to do site visits to the customers or anybody who's close to the subjects and get information on the ground to know them better. The third aspect of the investigation specialist is the data experts. Now, before any investigations, we conduct investigations. We look at the pool of financial transactions. From there, we look for outliers, and that's where we select transactions, and the forensic accountants would then comb through the selected transactions supporting documents. Last but not least, of course, the computer technologists, the specialists. In this instance, when we talk about potential cyber fraud, that's where we call in the experts to look at what really happened, how did these things happen, whose laptops has been compromised, and then there's another part. There are other technology experts where they would image laptops, mobile phones, and comb through the data that's residing in the hard drive, process them, and identify any relevant information that's required for the investigation. Now, I know all these sounds pretty technical, but in the next few slides, I would go through a case study, and that will help you to conceptualize this much better. Next slide, please. Now, in every investigation, we look at potential red flags, and a number of these, and it's not as easy as it sounds interpreting potential red flags, because the red flags itself, the word, it's quite a misnomer. It creates a false impression of plainly visible warning signs, but it's not. It's really a collection of all these signs that give you the sense of warning that a potential fraud may exist. Always remember that fraud is fundamentally a crime of deception, and that's why we have to go through a process of identifying different types of red flags, evidence, corroborate them, and then we try to make that fact find and identify whether fraud does exist. Catherine, the next two. Okay. All right. Can we move to the next slide? And so when we look at red flags, I'll go through, these are the common ones that we typically look at, and I'll go through a few of them right now. As I was mentioning, the thought process of conducting investigations, typically we use a data expert. We go through a set of transactions where there are potential concerns. If you recall the example, we talk about the vendor saying that they have payments that they've made, the vendor claims that there are outstanding payments, but the company claims that they've paid. So we look at the whole set of data and think about, well, what are the potential outliers from there? And then we choose those outliers to dive deeper into the documents. Now, the ones in circle right here, we talk about excessive purchases. That could be two types of situations over here. One, it could be a fictitious vendor altogether, and then you have excessive purchases. Or that the second situation where I think Mason was mentioning, there was a change in the bank account such that the hacker or the person controlling, the person behind the situation is able to make additional purchases and being paid through a different bank account, right? Another type of red flag is complaints. For this instance, the complaint coming from the vendor itself is not to be taken lightly. And or if the employees know of something in the complaint, that is something to be investigated. Missing documents, round-down numbers, and invoices just under approval amounts. Those are, again, I think telltale signs or, warning signs that potentially something could happen. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Catherine. Thank you. Okay, so I'll use a case study right now. I probably have 5 minutes to go through, but just bear with me. So I'll bring that whole concept that I've talked about all together, that will give you an idea of how we go about conducting an investigation with different type of specialists. Catherine, if you could show the 4 points over here. So this is a true case that we went through. The allegation was a junior accountant identified that the senior accountant had been canceling sales invoices during COVID. Now imagine during COVID, there was essential services were allowed to go back to the office. About 50% were allowed to go back to office. And the junior accountant, what happened was she was processing cash sale invoices. But when she went in, she got a number of these invoices. She took it from the senior accountant's in tray. When she went in to key into the accounting system, she realized that they had been canceled. The junior accountant then looked back in some of the records and realized there had been a number of these sales transactions that's being canceled. The junior accountant then realized there could be a potential fraud to this and reported to the CFO. And that's where we would then call in to conduct the investigation. Next slide, please. So this is what happened. So as a role, if you see at the top right-hand corner, this is the role of a forensic accountant. The allegation is such that on the left side, what happened was there was cash. The operation is such that there was cash on delivery collected by operations with a pro forma invoice created by accounts. When the operations personnel comes back to the office, they'll sign in into a cash logbook to say that the amount has been received. The accounts receivable accountant would then sign out in the logbook with saying that she has received the cash, and rightfully she should go into the accounting system to convert the pro forma invoice into a final invoice to acknowledge the sale. But she did not do that. I think what she did was she canceled the invoice altogether, so as if it didn't exist in the accounting system. And what she has done then, she pocketed the cash. Now, the data experts, you see at the top right-hand corner, help us with this situation. Because we know it relates to ERP, we ask the data experts to take the information from the ERP system and take a look and see how many of these invoices had been canceled by the accounts receivable accountant or the senior accountant. And we realized, we zoom in July, there was quite a huge number of items or invoices that are being purged or canceled. Next, please. The data experts then help us to zoom in and see that, in this particular day in July, there was a high number of items that's being cancelled. And for us, like I said, all these are red flags. They're not definitive signs or evidence that something had happened. So the first thing that came to mind to us at this point was, well, can we prove that she was at her desk at that point in time? And we asked for CCTV's backup. Next slide, please. So what we then did was we took her laptop, her mobile phone, and we imaged it and processed them. And we found evidence of a few things that's of concern. One, she has been transferring cash from her bank account to various people, where the total amount that's being transferred monthly is more than her pay itself. There were a lot of, online purchase of luxury handbags. And I think the last one was quite smoking gun, where there's an Excel spreadsheet where she has documented what we think are the invoices that she has canceled. Next slide, please. And so the technologies experts then help us to take a look at various things, right? If you see on the top box itself, we look at the accountant's Windows login details. And we saw that at this particular day, she indeed logged in from 9 to 10 in the evening. And then we then look at the ERP activity itself and saw that within this period of time, she did a lot of transactions. She did cancel the invoices. And at the same time, on the right side of the table, we're able to see that the accountant accessed the email activities at various times at the same time when she has deleted the ERP system. So what that did was to put the accountant into a situation where she cannot deny that she did not access her laptop, nor did she carry out any activities in the ERP system. Because with this evidence, along with the CCTV, along with what we covered from her laptop, the payments that's being made to various parties where total amounts more than her salary, all these are overwhelming evidence that we can present to her and conduct a confrontation interview. Next, please. So this is what we do. We bring all the evidence together. Right at the top, if you go clockwise, we trace the cancellation of the cash sales book, right? That's the first slide that I showed you. And then we went to the desk. We also found, various canceled sales invoices where the hard copies are being stashed in the drawers. We quantified the total losses. And at the same time, like I said, we confronted her. At the end of the day, initially when she looked at all the evidence, I must say that whenever we conduct such interviews, the victim, or not the victim, the perpetrator will always certainly deny, right? Even with overwhelming evidence. What she did then was, I think a day or two after, I think she knew that she couldn't deny any further. She decided to admit to the CEO. So I think this is the example that I have for everyone, how we go about conducting an investigation. And the losses that we calculated for this was around $800,000 US, fraud that was conducted over a 2-year period. And I think it's really accidental that something like that has been found. Now, I think the key takeaway from here are a few things, especially when you think about in terms of cyber fraud. It's similar to cyber fraud. Typically, an investigation will not be carried out until something happens. A complaint or whistleblower might come in. You conduct the investigation, you realize there's a loss, but much of the time, many of these losses has been dissipated, has been used by the perpetrator. And I think this is a good way for me to end my part of the presentation and hand it over to Sam, where he would then take you through in terms of the laws and regulations out there that might help you get some restitution of the losses. Sam?
Thanks very much, Ben. Fantastic. Yes, so my background is, as you probably can tell, is very much on the legal side. I come in these sort of situations where we need to engage, or rather the client needs to engage the assistance of either the investigating authorities or the courts. Just a bit of background from me. I'm qualified to practice in both Singapore and in England and Wales. I've been practicing law in Singapore for 13 years now, and mostly in large international firms, although I, together with my partner, set up our own firm in 2019, just before COVID. But that was fine because a lot of fraud and activity which falls within my practice area was occurring during COVID, so we weren't quiet. So that's a little bit of background on me. Essentially, what I'm going to talk about really is the next stage. Mason's spoken about how crypto fraud generally occurs and the types of techniques. Ben's talked about how you go and conduct an investigation to find out about the fraud, who's perpetrated it, and so on. My part of the presentation really is to look at what's your next step? What do you then do once you've had that confrontation, or indeed you've had that investigation? What options are there? Now, as with all lawyers' presentations, there's a disclaimer there. Have a read of it. It's pretty self-explanatory. So, Catherine, if we could move on to the first slide. Okay, so when I get involved, or when any lawyer gets involved in this process, it's usually straight after the fraud or the theft has been discovered. As Ben mentioned, it's very unusual for most companies to actually experience this. So it can be quite a panicky and emotional time for people. And it's very important, particularly when you're dealing with crypto or any kind of electronic fraud, such as the theft of or cheating, instances where you're sending money to a fake bank account after responding to a phishing or a spear phishing email. Acting quickly and correctly is absolutely critical. Okay. The first thing which clients will always say is we need to make a police report and the police will look into this. And there is some truth to that, but it's very important to understand that the two arms of the justice system in Singapore, the first being the criminal justice system and the second being the civil justice system, have two separate roles and can give you two separate remedies. So I want to start off by really putting yourselves in the position of the CEO or the CFO who's just discovered this fraud or this theft of assets, crypto, cash, whatever. What do you do? And to answer that question, I think you need to first understand what the two arms of the Singapore justice system do. And this would apply to other countries as well. The criminal justice system is really a system of enforcing the laws of the country you're in, the laws of the state. And it's a punitive system. It's designed to punish wrongdoers. Okay, it's absolutely right to report crimes, and you should report crimes. And if you do report crimes, you'll typically report them to an investigating authority. And for these sort of incidents, theft and fraud, the three most common, or rather two most common, are going to be the Singapore Police Force and specifically the Commercial Affairs Department of the Singapore Police Force. And if it's a regulated entity, the Monetary Authority of Singapore can also act as an investigating authority. Anything to do with corruption or bribery, the investigating authority is called the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau. But in pretty much all of these cases, your first port of call will be the Commercial Affairs Department of the Singapore Police Force. The civil arm of the justice system in Singapore is not so much a punitive system of punishing wrongdoing. It's designed to achieve remedies for people who have been wronged by other people, companies that have been wronged by other people or companies. Okay, it's compensatory. It allows you to recover assets. A very different system to the criminal justice system, and the two can work but hand in hand. The Supreme Court of Singapore is the overall authority which ultimately deals with civil matters. It also deals with criminal matters, but in civil cases, you would be bringing a claim in the High Court of Singapore if the claim amount is more than a $250,000 Singapore dollars. And for claims smaller than that, it would be through the District Court of Singapore, also known as the State Court of Singapore. So Katrin, if you could, next slide. When you report a crime in Singapore, you need to make a police report, much the same in any other countries. And this triggers the police investigation. The way you make that police report really depends on the amount of information that you've got and the urgency of your situation. Online police reports can be made. If you want the police to act quickly, we always recommend to clients to go down in person to the police station and make the report there and then, and bring the evidence that you have with you. The Commercial Affairs Department is located down in Cantonment. There's a large police building there. And bear in mind that they're open during office hours. So ideally, making a police report at the Commercial Affairs Department is what you want to do, and come along with your evidence. The other thing to bear in mind with the police, as in every country, they are stretched very thin, particularly when it comes to financial matters. Singapore being a financial hub, it's no secret that particularly over COVID, financial fraud, crypto fraud has been rising, and the police have a lot on their plate. Now, this is important to understand, because when you're deciding what's going to get you the best immediate outcome, the police will do their best, but it is not necessarily the case that the police are going to be able to act as quickly as you might like them to. Okay, the best way of getting the police to act is to come to them with as much evidence as you possibly can to point to who the suspected perpetrators are, as well as what evidence that you've got linking them to the alleged crime, or indeed at least repositories or other witnesses who may be able to assist them to build a case. On presenting the police report, if you can present a very compelling case to the relevant investigating officer, you're more likely to have the police act quickly. Now, I'll tell you a personal experience of this assisting a client. We had a client who was the subject of a theft of Bitcoin, a very not particularly complicated fraud. It was an over-the-counter Bitcoin trade where it was very difficult to buy Bitcoin on exchanges, and so the client had arranged with what they thought was a legitimate third-party seller to buy the Bitcoin using an intermediary who was brokering the deal. Unfortunately for the clients, it turned out to be a sham, and the money was paid, but the Bitcoin never came through, despite various precautions that the client took. What was interesting about that case is that the intermediary had come to Singapore to broker the deal, so the intermediary was in Singapore. So the first thing we do is we go down to the police and to essentially make the report, and to also plead that this individual not be allowed to leave the country. But this, unfortunately, just given the urgency of the matter, we weren't able to present enough evidence really to justify the police putting a flag on this individual with the Immigration and Customs Authority here in Singapore, ICA, which would have stopped him leaving the country. Okay, if you go to the police with sufficient evidence, they have many tools at their disposal to prevent, for example, suspects from leaving the country, and indeed to go in and prevent evidence from being tampered with, and so on. But it all really depends on how much information you can provide them up front to assist them in their investigations. Once you make a police report, the police will assign what's known as an investigating officer to the case, who will be there to assist you. It's important whenever engaging with the police that you always keep them up to date and informed of everything that you're doing to try and remedy the situation. And especially if you start a civil claim, okay, because it's important to make sure that the police investigation isn't upset by other measures that you're taking. Could you put the next slide up, please, Catherine? The way it works is that the investigating authority, in this case usually the police, gathers the evidence of the alleged crime, and then will try to build a case to present that to the Attorney General's chambers in Singapore. They're the prosecuting authority here. And then the Attorney General's chambers will take a view as to whether they have enough evidence, and if it's in the public interest, to start a prosecution against the alleged perpetrator of the crime. If that prosecution is successful, that would lead to a conviction and relevant penalties being put on the perpetrator, which naturally could include fine or jail time. However, again, we come back to the difference between the criminal and the civil justice systems. The criminal justice system only has very limited powers in order to compensate victims for lost assets and damages associated with that. They're called compensation orders, and they can be provided. But if you're dealing with a large commercial crime, large commercial fraud, they're very rare, because typically the court will say you should go down the civil justice route to get your compensation. Next slide, please, Catherine. Thank you. So this is where we come back to civil proceedings. Again, you find the fraud has taken place. Your first instinct is to go to the police, which may well be the right thing to do, but you shouldn't discount the assistance that you can be given from the civil courts. And broadly speaking, there are 4 things that they can do. They can help you recover that assets or money that's stolen, get you compensation. But also they can assist in the investigation process. And I'll talk about some of those remedies that the courts can provide. So next slide, please, Catherine. Okay. The typical orders that the court will allow at the end of what's called a suit, which is the process of going through the court process till trial and a court judgment, is that they can require both assets themselves to be returned, including money and including cryptocurrency. There's an interesting series of cases in New Zealand, England, and also Singapore, which are all part of the common law, so have similar systems of justice, which have begun to recognize cryptocurrency, and specifically Bitcoin and Ethereum, as property. And what this means now when it comes to Bitcoin and Ethereum theft, that it is legally possible for the courts to actually require the return of those Bitcoin or that Ethereum or other cryptocurrency, and potentially NFTs as well, although to my knowledge that hasn't yet been tested, to return those assets to you. And they can even be traced. Now, what do I mean by tracing? I mean a situation where the initial thief or the initial person who's misappropriated the Bitcoin then moves it over to other accomplices or indeed third parties. The court system can allow you to follow those assets through that trail and require any third party who's ultimately holding an asset to give it back to you. That is possible. In addition to that, the courts can also award damages. Okay, and you'll all be familiar with this concept. Damages are really compensation that, as far as money can do it, can put you back in the position that you were in before the theft or the wrongdoing occurred. And that doesn't just include the value of the Bitcoin that you've lost. It also includes things, let's say, if this has disrupted your business and caused consequential losses, you can be compensated for them. The costs of the investigation and the costs of taking out proceedings in the courts can also be given back to you at the end of the court process. Another useful tool that the courts allow after you've got your judgment is the ability to freeze assets globally of any defendant who judgment has been entered into against. That doesn't necessarily, again, have to be the person who is found to have misappropriated the cryptocurrency or your other assets, but also accomplices, anybody else involved in a conspiracy. And Singapore court judgments can apply not just in Singapore, but can also be enforced overseas. Catherine, if you could just next slide. So one of the useful things about previous slide, actually, Catherine. Perfect, thank you. One of the useful things about Singapore as a place to start proceedings to go after perpetrators who misappropriated cryptocurrency or other electronic assets is that typically Singapore court orders are more easily enforced than the court orders of some other countries. So, and Singapore being a financial hub and part of the sort of common law group of countries means that Singapore has a lot of relationships with other jurisdictions, which will allow you to enforce court orders. The more relatively straightforward ones are any Commonwealth country, such as the UK, India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, countries like that. Singapore has a very special relationship with Malaysia for reciprocal enforcement of judgments, as well as, interestingly, China and Japan as well. Also, generally speaking, are quite friendly towards enforcing Singapore judgments. So Singapore courts can be very helpful, not just in cases of Singapore-based theft where the perpetrator and assets are in Singapore, but also more internationally. Another interesting legal development, which I alluded to in the introduction, which actually is the judgment only came out in March this year, is in this case of CLM versus CLN and others, which is an extremely peculiar case which involves the theft of Bitcoin and Ethereum. And it perhaps assists and it adds another tool to what the courts can do in situations where you don't actually know who the perpetrator is. And I'll explain by telling you an abridged story of this case. The case involved an American national and a group of his associates. I imagine they called them associates because of what happened next may mean that they weren't necessarily friends. But they all went to Mexico together for a visit and stayed at the claimant, the person who's started the actions, apartment. The claimant and one of his friends were out one night and were obviously partying quite hard because about 2 a.m. The claimant put in a call to the apartment to say, can you get me some money out to one of his friends? And he gave the friends the code to the safe in the apartment where he kept his money. But he didn't only keep his money there, he also kept keys to allow the accessing of his password to hit 2 hot wallets, which he would access through his mobile phone, to allow him to conduct transactions in both Bitcoin and Ethereum. That was in the safe. So anyway, he got his money, and the next evening, he checks on his mobile phone on his Bitcoin and Ethereum holdings, and they're gone. There were a number of people, I believe it was around about 7, in that apartment, and they don't know who it was. They don't know if it was one of those friends or if it was somebody from the outside or somebody to come in to clean or whatever. They don't know who it was who took that Bitcoin. They managed to trace the Bitcoin and Ethereum through various transactions back to 2 accounts which were controlled by 2 exchanges in Singapore, and that's why the case came to Singapore. Now, one of the remedies that the claimant wanted was effectively a freezing order to stop whoever had his Ethereum and Bitcoin from moving it or diminishing its value. But the problem was they didn't know who took it. But in a landmark case for Singapore law, which follows on similar cases in England and Wales as well, and other Commonwealth countries, the court actually recognized two things. Firstly, it recognized, interestingly, that Bitcoin and Ethereum can be considered as property. And so coming back to Mason's earlier question is, what are you actually buying here? As far as the law goes in Singapore and New Zealand and some other Commonwealth countries, they are recognized as property, but also that you could make an order preventing certain individuals fitting a description from dealing with those assets or diminishing their value. So essentially what you had was an order against anybody who fitted this description. It was known as a persons unknown injunction, or an order against persons unknown. And anyone who fits that description, which includes anybody who actually took the cryptocurrency, but also anybody who assisted in the misappropriation of that Bitcoin currency, is under a court order not to deal with it or dissipate it. And if should you breach a court order, you can be thrown in jail for that. So again, may not necessarily be a game changer, but when it comes to actually practical remedies to assist in these sort of issues, that is quite an interesting case development. Next slide, please, Catherine. So persons unknown injunctions, a freezing injunction, even when you don't know who the perpetrators are. There are other very useful tools that the courts can provide, particularly to assist in the investigation or recovery of misappropriated property. Perhaps one of the most extreme and one that actually we were involved with FTI assisting on the forensics side is something called a search order, also known historically as an Anton Pillar order. And essentially what this is an order that the court can make to allow you to go to a suspected perpetrator's address and seize documents, passwords to online storage repositories, and things like hard drives, computers, mobile phones, and so on. It's a very difficult order to get. You have to show that you have a good arguable case. Which essentially means you've got to show clear evidence that the perpetrator has in all likelihood actually misappropriated your documents or your assets. It's an order that you can do on what's known as a without notice basis. So you can do it without the alleged perpetrator even being aware. And in effect, what you do is you show up at their house at 9 o'clock in the morning or at their office with the order, which compels them to provide you with everything you need, and your forensic experts, in our case FTI, sit there and download and take all of the keys of everything that they need, and you can even before the case against that perpetrator has started, you can develop a very comprehensive picture of what they've been doing. So that's a very effective tool if you have the right ingredients and the correct amount of evidence to get the court to give it to you. There are other tools that the courts can offer. A common one when dealing with crypto or indeed financial fraud, particularly from phishing emails where you've been conned into paying for an invoice or a large amount of money to a third-party bank account, are what are known as what used to be known as Norwich Pharmacal orders. These names are based on the cases which decided them. But anyway, essentially what it is an order from the court to a third party, usually a bank, but also a crypto exchange, for them to provide you with information that can identify the perpetrator, even before you've actually started the case against the perpetrator. And these orders are very, very useful when it comes to tracing crypto assets and tracing money, as in which bank accounts and which wallets has that passed through. Okay, and these orders can be obtained against essentially third-party intermediaries to compel them to give you that information on their clients. The other one, which I'll just touch on briefly, is what's known as a freezing order, and this is what happened in the case, this landmark case, which I just talked about. it's also, if you're in a situation where you think that your cryptocurrency has been taken, you have an idea, let's say, what exchange it's sitting in, or indeed who the perpetrator is, and you're concerned that it's going to be dissipated, meaning that it's going to be split up and moved through many, many, many different wallets on other exchanges around the world. You can, the court can give you what's known as a freezing injunction, which can apply globally, which compels the named parties to not touch that cryptocurrency and preserve it and not diminish its value, which would be very, very helpful, particularly while you're conducting an investigation, to preserve the status quo until you can finally go through the court proceeding and get your judgment. One final point, and I'm going to wrap up because I'm conscious of the time. Another useful trick which you can use sort of through the legal system in order to try and prevent money which you've accidentally paid into the wrong bank account, the fraudster's bank account, or paid into the fraudster's crypto exchange wallet, is by using money laundering legislation. In a lot of countries, including in Singapore, any person who has reasonable grounds to suspect that property which comes into their possession is effectively the proceeds of a crime has to report it, and then they're restricted on how they can deal with it. And if they dissipate or move it, they can themselves be investigated for money laundering. Now, this is a very effective tool, particularly when you're dealing with any regulated entity, certainly banks, but also increasingly crypto exchanges. As soon as you've identified the bank account or the exchange where that money went, immediately contact them and notify them. And that should, in effect, freeze the asset, because it will give them reasonable grounds to suspect of a potential proceeds of crime coming into their possession or control, require them to report it to the authorities, and then stop them from dealing with it. Okay, so that is a very useful tool, and it needs to be done very quickly. Anyway, that's it from me. We've got a brief moment for some questions and answers. So I'll hand over to Catherine for, or rather, Catherine, would you like me to read them out? Okay, so we've got some questions here. Could everybody pop onto the screen? Very good.
Yeah, so there's one question here that I can read. It's basically, during my time with the FBI, what was the success rate for solving cases of crypto fraud or theft? Unfortunately, I don't have numbers for you in terms of like a percentage success rate. I mean, for better or worse, typically with a large agency like the FBI, we had limited resources and we're constantly having to prioritize what cases to investigate. So in the federal system, basically we, depending on jurisdiction, for example, say like New York City, we're probably not going to get involved unless you're talking millions of dollars of loss. Unfortunately, so I guess the takeaway there is if you're gonna commit fraud, do it in a big city, because they just have, the thresholds for prosecution are just much higher. But oftentimes we had a decent amount of success, but it has a lot to do with, I mean, in a case that involves digital assets, that really depends on sort of what kind of forensic data we can get. And there are actually a lot of private companies that have entered this space that have really powerful and interesting technologies in terms of blockchain asset tracing and sort of dealing with what they call mixers, right, in terms of to obfuscate or wash digital assets that are being transferred between multiple currencies. But it really depends. It depends on the nature of the investigation, but we had a lot of success.
I see another question that's for me. And the question is, should companies always ask for external parties to conduct investigation, or it can be done in-house? And the answer is really, it depends. It depends on the value of the investigation. If it is going to be an investigation that's requested from a regulatory body, then definitely the external parties coming in will give a very good independent review. And on top of that, if you try to see in-house, if you try to conduct this in-house, the question is, does the in-house investigators have enough of skill sets that's able to produce the information that regulators want to see? On the flip side, if it's going to be a very small allegation that comes true, then I think if you think further ahead, whether the regulators will come, to know of this issue, the answer is probably no at that point. Then I would say go and conduct an internal investigation first before you move on to conduct or engage external parties. I've seen, and in fact, this is one of the investigations that we've been through recently, where it is a Chinese investment bank. They conducted an internal review, and they realized that the Singapore subsidiary's CEO has been siphoning or potentially siphoning a lot of funds out from the bank through different types of investment channels, right? So they have an idea of where the funds has gone out or how the funds has gone out, but they needed us to come in to give a more structured investigation to this and to reach out to other resources in other countries to corroborate more evidence that we could obtain, right? So that's then at the end of the day, what they want to do is to put a legal case against the ex-CEO and claim for the money back. So that's the value. So it really depends. There's no hard and fast rule to it. I would say at the end of the day, think of, well, where is the end route for the investigation? Is it going to be produced in a court of law? Then if it is, external parties, you should engage external parties right away.
I'll just add to that, Ben, just from a legal perspective, one of the advantages of getting external parties involved early is that if you're going to go into some sort of court process, particularly civil courts, it provides you with the protection of what's called privilege. So particularly if you're engaging with lawyers, that allows you to keep a lot of your internal investigation or confidential, even when it comes to a regulator. So any legal advice, and legal advice is usually provided with the assistance of your sort of forensic accountants and so on, particularly where there's a risk of the company itself being in breach of some regulation or legal requirements. You're allowed to conduct your own investigation internally and get advice from lawyers without the regulators actually being able to see all of that. So it can give you a confidentiality there. The other advantage when it comes to experts such as forensic accountants and so on is that your internal people may be very, very good, but they're not going to be able to stand up in court and present evidence to the court because they're not independent. The advantage of external service providers is they are independent and that they can not only assist you at the early stage, but also all the way through to presenting that evidence before the court, something that your internal people can't do. So those are a couple of advantages.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah. We got another question. It's is it possible to have your computer compromised by simply opening an email, or do you need to open an attachment or click a link? So I will answer this question in sort of general practical sense. It is difficult or unlikely for a computer to be compromised without taking some action on your part. So if it gives you some level of comfort, you're certainly better off by not clicking things. But I mean, sort of speaking more accurately, I mean, so this has to do, it really has to do with the sort of resources and motivation of the adversary. So, I mean, clearly we've seen, there's a famous Israeli group called NSO group, who's been using malware called I think it's Pegasus, basically to compromise iPhones, which are basically small computers, right? They call it zero click, right? So they compromise a very, very clever compromise where your phone is able to be compromised without you even knowing it, right? So you know, effectively, if people have enough motivation and resources, I hate to say it, there's not a lot you can really do. I mean, the best thing you could do is, you know, and sort of nation states do this, and very sensitive, you know, I mean, I've talked to very large producers for Disney, actually, who operate systems that are air gapped, right? So their computers are all completely disconnected from the internet. You know, and that is common practice if you're dealing with very sensitive information, and that's really the only effective way to prevent a compromise. But even then, you know, security researchers have proof of concepts where they encode and transmit data by varying the frequency of a computer fan or the hard drive platter. So I mean, it's really, it depends how paranoid you want to be. In general, you should be okay if you don't click links.
Thanks very much, Mason. It's interesting. You reminded me. I don't know if anybody's a fan of the Battlestar Galactica series, but if you are, you'll know that they survived because they had their systems offline at the time of the cyber attack. So that always is in the back of my mind. Listen, I think we're running slightly over time, so I'm going to just wrap it up by saying a huge thank you to both Ben and Mason for sharing all of their thoughts this afternoon. I found it particularly useful, and it's always good to hear from people who actually are at the coalface and do this thing day to day. Happily, most organisations out there don't have to deal with fraud, and if they do, it's mercifully rare. So thank you both very much. Just putting my chamber hat on again, I'd just like to highlight a few upcoming events which you can see on the slide in front of you. On the 9th of June, all of these are in person, you'll be pleased to know. We have a presentation on the role of leadership in driving sustainable change within organizations. On the 22nd of June, we have a cross-chamber networking drinks concentrated on the healthcare sector. Particular interest actually is Leaders in Business talk by the Minister for Finance, the Right Honourable Lawrence Wong, co-chair of the COVID-19 Multi-Ministry Task Force and Deputy Chairman of the Monetary Authority in Singapore. And that's quite an impressive speaker, and it's something I certainly signing up for myself. And then we have Leaders in Business lunch with Ms. Jacqueline Poe, the Managing Director of the EDB, another very good event should you wish to attend. Again, all of these are in person, so I imagine there'll be some drinks and nibbles afterwards. So again, thank you very much, Ben and Mason. On behalf of the Chamber, hopefully we'll see you again at a Chamber event soon. And once again, thank you very much to everybody for taking the time this evening to join us. And well, we hope to see you at the next Chamber event. Goodbye.
Thanks very much for everything.
Yeah, no worries. How it was